pleasure. Anytime you get to leave DC and see people who are actually working is really fun. So just a couple things before I get started. I was in the ladies' room just now, and I heard someone say, if this is boring, I'm going to leave. And I only know you by your shoes, but let me know afterwards if it's boring. Or I guess I'll know if you leave. The other note is that if you see my bio, it says very arrogantly, a veteran of public service at age 25. Unfortunately, as of yesterday, I'm 26 now, so legitimately a veteran. Also, I feel like this is true Hollywood story because I'm a real live millennial, as are you. And so it is a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you guys today about what it means to be a millennial, a little bit about how I got here, what my organization does, then I'm going to share some of the most impressive and inspiring facts about our generation. And then, because I am from New Jersey and I'll speak very quickly, I hope that you have time for questions, and I look forward to hearing about your great work and hearing from my fellow millennials in the room. The first thing I want to tell you about is a little bit about my organization, mobilize.org. I've had the pleasure of running this amazing organization for 4 years, 3 years as their chief operating officer, and 1.5 years as their CEO, which is a title only my mom is impressed with. But I came to Mobilize as we were launching an initiative called Democracy 2.0, which you'll see on either side of me. What we found was that too often the young people in this room, my peers, are talked about as if we're the leaders of tomorrow versus having the capacity to lead today. And what we realized was that we needed to take our own leadership capacity in our own hands and define the democracy that we want to inherit. And that became named a project called Democracy 2.0. We put out a national survey on July 4th, 2007, asking young people what's working and what's not working within our democracy, and what are the unique characteristics of this generation that empower us to make a change. Really quickly, what do you guys think works best in our democracy according to our generation? The post office. So for 3 years now, we found that the post office, according to our generation, is what they see as most effective and efficient, which I always thought was a really fun fact. We got thousands of responses, and what we realized was that it was our calling and our opportunity to take action and equip millennials with the skills and the resources they needed to take action on the issues that are most important to them. The first year, the issues that came up were America's role in the world, economic inequality, the role of money in politics. This year, as you would imagine, they're all economic. The high cost of college education, unemployment, predatory lending practices in college campuses and low-income communities. And what Mobilize did is we created a summit process where young people come together to talk about the issues that they've identified as most important, propose solutions, and then work collaboratively to implement those solutions, because really we're the ones who can best address the most important issues that we're facing. We brought together, once we took these survey results, we brought together 47 of the respondents for a day-long training in Washington, D.C., where they were to write this declaration that you see in front of me. They spent from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. at the Capitol, and wordsmithing and working with the results, and at 6 p.m. I got up, really respectful of their time, and I said, thank you so much, we can take it from here. And they said, we're not done yet. We're writing a declaration for our generation, and we're going to need some pizza, and we'll let you know when we're done. So we brought 43 of the 47 respondents back to our small nonprofit office, got them some soda, got them some pizzas, and they wrote for 6 more hours. At 12:07 a.m., they knocked on my door, and they said, Maya, we're done. And whether it was how tired I was or how much pizza I ate, as they read it to me, I cried like a baby. And it was for the first time in my nonprofit career that I saw something that was owned by such a large group of young people who were for the first time laying out the democracy that we are proud to inherit and lead. And so if I were to say this is definitely the document that I'm most proud of, it's on our website, and it sort of spurred the movement of our work. I'll step back a little bit and tell you about myself and how I got here. I never had a choice about getting involved in politics, as I'm sure many people here didn't as well. I'm the daughter of 2 Romanian immigrants. My mom was a journalist for a communist newspaper, and my father was an architect. And my mom went to sleep one night in their nice apartment, and they had great jobs, and she dreamt of a little girl playing on a playground wearing pigtails and purple pants. And she woke up the next morning sobbing because she knew that in Romania, I couldn't have worn purple pants because the colors under communism were black and brown, and that I wouldn't have the opportunity to vote, I wouldn't have the opportunity to freely practice religion, I wouldn't have the opportunity to speak my mind in a newspaper or anywhere else. And so she shook my dad awake and said, we need to go to America. And they sought political asylum here, and 3 years later I was born. 5 years later, my younger brother was born. And so we grew up with a deep, deep appreciation for the opportunities and obligations that we had here as United States citizens. I went on to Rutgers University, where on the first day of school I came into college and I said, I'm ready to declare my major. I'm going to declare my major in political science, urban studies. I'm going to graduate in 3 years because I need to work on the election, so just like file whatever papers you need to file. They said, you have more time. You don't have to figure it out right this second. But I had already figured it out, and I graduated in May 2004. I'll tell you guys a little bit of personal information. The fall of my freshman year in college, I broke up with my high school sweetheart. It was devastating. And to tide me over and find something to do, I Google searched youth activism because I knew that that's what I was passionate about. Some people deal with breakups in weird ways. That was how I did. The first link that came up was an organization called Rock the Vote. How many of you guys have heard of Rock the Vote? Awesome. So I applied to be the New Jersey street team coordinator for Rock the Vote for the summer that the MTV Beach House was in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. And I got it, so I walked up and down the boardwalk for the entire summer, registering young people to vote, registering some older people, including Method Man and Red Man as well, as they sort of sat at the craft service table. But that summer, I registered 10,000 young people to vote and realized that my true passion was engaging young people in democracy. I went back to school. Rock the Vote said, Maya, we have this opportunity. We'd like you to come be East Coast coordinator for Rock the Vote. I was 19 years old, in my book, free from my parents. And so I called my mom. I said, Mom, I got offered a job. People go to college for jobs, so I'm all set. I'm just going to take this job. She said, no, you're not. And I called Rock the Vote, and I said, what can I do? And they offered me the job while I was in school, and for 4 years I was the East Coast coordinator for Rock the Vote, and managed their street team programs from Maine to Florida. How many of you guys have ever heard of the Hip Hop Political Convention? How many of you have seen the Brick City documentary? No? Okay, so Brick City is a name for Newark, New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey is a phenomenal, historic city in New Jersey that has gone through some radical transformations after the past couple of decades. A group of my friends and I got together and we said, what if we had a conference? What if we celebrated young people in the hip-hop generation here in Newark, New Jersey? So we planned for this big conference. We thought 3,000 people at most were going to come to hear MC Lyte and all of these phenomenal celebrities talk about what it means to be a young person living in the hip-hop generation. 9,000 people came to Newark. They slept in tents, in buses, in cars, in hotel rooms, 10 to a hotel, and they got so excited about the momentum of the 2004 election that we truly built a movement. We registered 300,000 young people in 13 states, and I woke up on November 3rd, 2004, and turned out the stories that they were telling about our generation is that we had, again, not voted. And I knew that wasn't true because mathematically I had registered them all. And I knew that that wasn't true, but because we didn't have a collective message, and because we weren't talking to young people about the issues that they should vote for, we lost that moment in time that should have been ours. And that's when I realized that it was more important to talk to the young people about the issues that are impacting their everyday lives than it is just to talk to them about their civic duty and their responsibility. And so for the past 4 years, I've been working at Mobilize. We just changed our mission statement, so I'm going to beta test it on you guys and tell you a little bit about Millennials. Our mission statement in your packet is that we educate, empower, and energize members of the millennial generation to increase our civic engagement and political participation. We work to show young people how public policy impacts our lives, and conversely, how public policy, or how we can impact public policy. It's kind of boring, right? Yeah, thing. It's okay, I didn't make it up. Our new mission statement is that Mobilize.org improves the way democracy works by investing in millennial-led solutions. Because as much as I use the millennial makeover as a Bible, the millennials aren't coming, they aren't gonna lead, they're here and we're leading now. And it's important that organizations respect that and learn to adapt to it. So I compiled 10 facts that I think you should know about millennials and things that I think I'm particularly proud of. And if you guys can just raise your hand if you knew this already, that would be super helpful. So the question of who are the millennials, and then we can go into empowering the millennials. Did you guys know that Facebook has 200 million users who log on at least once a week? You knew that? Awesome. Morley already told us that our generation is 80 million strong, making us the largest generation. The millennial generation has a sense of service, which many tie to September 11th. September 11th was the first Tuesday of my college career, and living, right across from New York City, it was definitely a big moment in my life. But in 2008, 9.8 million millennials volunteered a staggering amount of 1.87 billion volunteer hours and made up more than half of all new volunteers, which you guys should give yourselves a big round of applause for. Dr. Dobson mentioned briefly the Civic Health Index that's going to be coming out for Florida in a couple of days. The National Civic Health Index that was released in September shows that there's bad news for our civic health across the board. But the one beacon of hope, the one greatest civic generation is millennials who are on track to become, in fact, the new greatest civic generation. And as you heard from Morley, while we voted 2-to-1 Democrat in the 2008 election, studies show that our generation is increasingly independent, rejecting the two-party system, which sort of is what led to our use of the word all-partisan. As Anya told you before, we're a generation that's heavily in debt. And while I might argue that I don't need 3 Starbucks a day, the real reasons for why we're in debt aren't because we're impulsive or apathetic. The number one reason we're in debt are our education costs. And the number 2 reason we're in debt are our healthcare costs, with a college graduate having an average of $27,000 in debt. And shockingly, but sort of in line with that debt, is that almost 50% of our generation isn't going on to seek higher education and going on to college. And Anya's book has some phenomenal reasons and solutions for that. And how many of you check your email every day? How many check it at least every other day? Great. So a plurality of the people in the room consider themselves very tech savvy. How many of you text? Yeah. The Twitter hashtag for this is Maya is awesome. So while we all consider ourselves very tech savvy, a recent Benton Foundation poll showed that only 62% of our generation have consistent and reliable access to broadband internet. So every time we start thinking about the digital divide not existing as much, we need to keep that in mind. Last 2 facts, and I don't mean to bum you out with these, I shouldn't have made them in this order. But given the debt to earnings ratio for our generation, we have a negative savings rate. I'm sure Anya talked a lot about that, but there's an urgent need for us to do something about that. And really interestingly for us and the work we do with veterans, we're the first generation that is hugely against the war, but hugely supportive of the troops. And I think that that's a very, very important thing that we're learning a lot from right now. What else are we? We're collaborative, we're global, we're technological, we're diverse, we're entrepreneurial, and there's a number of other really important things, all of which people have talked about today. But why should people care? How do we become empowered millennials? I think there's really three things that need to be kept in mind about our generation. And again, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm talking about all of us here in the room. In terms of what we value, I think the first is inclusivity. I think we're the most diverse, most inclusive, most tolerant generation that exists. And what you'll see more and more of is when I started my career, I was very much the token young person at all of these tables. There would be conversations already underway, and they'd say, we need a young person there, let's call Maya. How many of you guys have been in that position where you're the token young person? Great, and that's what I would say. It's not happening as much. And so that's great to see that people are beginning to recognize our power in terms of being millennials, having an authentic voice. The second thing that I would say we value immensely is transparency. If you look at our social networks, online and offline, and you see who we trust, if you look at, again, with the Civic Health Index, millennials have a huge, and you saw with Morley's slide, a really impressive trust in our institutions that hasn't existed in previous times. The last thing I would mention is that the opportunities for collective decision-making are really valuable. We learned an important lesson in the 2008 election in terms of watching a campaign give up control and treat young people as something other than foot soldiers. Both on the McCain campaign, on the Obama campaign, within the first couple hires, both campaigns created a youth team. This is the first presidential election in which youth wasn't an afterthought. And they didn't send out press releases about it. They didn't say, we've brought on Hans Riemer, pat us on the back, we're reaching out to the youth vote. Young people, our votes were a necessary part of winning the election, and it was just sort of a given, and that was really impressive to see. In terms of opportunities for collective decision-making, there's also a burden on our side, and I'll tell you just a really quick story about millennials making sure that we're telling people what we're good at and standing up for ourselves and being confident. So when I ran the Hip Hop Civic Engagement Project, my boss said to me, Maya, write the story of what happened here. Write about who was here, write about what went well, and just give it to me. So I wrote 12 pages. He submitted it verbatim to a funder, and we got $1.2 million to run this campaign. So me telling the story of what happened is what funded our work. So I went and I got my next internship at an organization called Common Cause. And they said, what do you want to do, Maya? And I said, I want to write grants. I'm really good at it. They said, but what we need right now is for people to be on the phone and call people about this legislation. And I said, just let me write grants. And they sort of ignored me and said, this is what we need. So I sat there for literally at least a week with my phone, my finger on the receiver, reciting pay-to-play legislation talking points and asking people for donations, but actually talking to a dead phone because I wasn't comfortable telling them that I didn't want to do this, and they didn't take enough time to invest in me to see that I could, in fact, have raised that organization a significant amount of money. So while we're looking for opportunities to be a leader, and it's very important on the other side to step up and take those responsibilities on. How many of you are on a board of a student group, of a community group? A couple people. Fantastic. In a couple of weeks, I'm coming back to Orlando to give a speech to an organization called Board Source. Of the leading 100 funders of youth civic engagement issues, how many of them do you think have a young person under the age of 40 on their board of directors? Zero. Zero of them. So the leading funders of the youth civic engagement field do not have a single beneficiary making decisions on how the money is spent. And so that's something that if you haven't joined a board, if you are looking for leadership opportunities, that's a fantastic way to get involved. One of the things that we talked about a lot today, Anya mentioned it, is about student debt and about being your own advocate and lobbying for decreased college tuition. How many of you are planning to go to a state school here in Florida? Awesome, fantastic. I am a proud graduate of state school in Rutgers University, and our organization was founded for a fight for tuition. So I'm just going to tell you a really quick story about how Mobilize was founded, which is sort of the story of one empowered millennial. In 2002, David Smith was a sophomore at Cal. He was working 2 jobs. He lived off campus because he couldn't afford the rent and there wasn't enough affordable housing. He was in a fraternity, and he got a letter at home one day saying that your student tuition is going to go up $6,000. No explanation, just from the regents, your tuition's going up. And he was sitting around the living room with his fraternity brothers, and they said, what can we do about this? You know, if you've ever met Dave's mom, you know that he was going to have to stay in school, and he couldn't drop out, and she was not giving him another penny. And so he needed to figure this out on his own. And so the fraternity boys went together, and they went to meet with the UC Regent. And the lobbyist for the UC Regent said, well, millennials, young people, you just need to show up. And they went back and they said, what does it mean? What does it mean to just show up? And they thought about what that meant, and they realized they mean go and meet with your elected officials in Sacramento. So they organized what became called Cal Lobby Day. They brought 110 young people from Berkeley down to Sacramento, and they pulled up in buses, and the police sort of greeted the buses, and Dave stepped off the bus and said, you know, why is there this extra police presence? And they said, well, you know, we thought the Berkeley kids are coming, they're going to chain themselves to things. And they said, no, we actually just want to talk to our elected officials. And so this one particular meeting that Dave was in, he had done his research ahead of time, and he knew that the elected official sitting across the table from him had gone to Berkeley as well, had lived in the same freshman dorm as him, and had had similar experiences with him. And so he turns to this elected official and says, sir, how was Berkeley when you went there? And he just starts happily. He says, it was fantastic. We went to football games, and I went to Blondie's Pizza, and we would barbecue in Bowles Hall, and I had this fantastic room, and then Jimmy, my roommate, had this room across the hall, and we had this lounge in the middle where we used to entertain guests. And he's fondly reminiscing about what it was like to be a college student in his day. And he turned to Dave and he said, tell me about it now. And Dave said, it's almost exactly the same. I go to Blondie's Pizza, I get excited for football games, especially the big game. We have barbecues on Bowles Hall. The only little difference is that room that you were in, they now have 2 students living in that room. And your roommate Jimmy, that room that he was in, there's 2 students living in there. And that lounge where you used to entertain guests, they have 4 students living in there now. So it's almost exactly the same, except where 2 students were living, there are now 8. And the elected official was just quiet, and Dave thought he had certainly messed it up, and they'd bring the police back in. And the elected official said, that room was too small for Jimmy and I. What can we do about it? And the first Cal Lobby Day resulted in a $90 million housing bond passed to create affordable student housing near campus, and the first ever moratorium on student tuition increases in the state of California. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long, but what really started Mobilize and why we were founded is because we realized that if millennials don't go and talk to decision makers and talk to peers about what it's like to be in our shoes, then we can't expect to see the changes that we want to happen. What's the Mexican place right here? Qdoba. So I was walking by, and it said, follow Q on our social networks. And then it linked their Twitter and their Facebook. Our means of communications, the tools of communication that our generation has created, we should be so excited and so proud of the innovation that's coming from us. There's a phenomenal blogger whose name is Sean Stanton, and he and I were talking, and I asked him what he thinks about all of this new attention in new media. And he said, Maya, when the fax machine was invented, people were like, how do you have time to fax? You're so busy calling people. And you're totally not going to have time to fax because you're writing these letters, licking these envelopes, putting stamps on them, and then you have these phone calls and you have to check your messages. There's no way the fax is going to stay around. And then the computer came around and people were like, there's no way that you're going to have time to respond to your emails because you're licking the envelopes, writing the letters, putting the stamps on them, making the phone calls, checking the messages, returning the calls, faxing the papers, getting your faxes, and now emails. So social media and the way that our generation communicates is just another evolution in the communication of our generation, and we should be super proud of it. I mentioned before that our generation is very entrepreneurial and innovative, and I have the great pleasure of having been on the social innovation transition team for the president, and or working with the social innovation team, and work closely with the Office of Public Engagement now on millennial issues. And I will say one note of caution about our entrepreneurial spirit. I had the pleasure of meeting with Margaret McKenna, who's the head of the Walmart Foundation, and she said, Maya, I'm having the hardest time finding my predecessor because none of the millennials want to work for Walmart. They all want to start their own thing, or they all say bad things about Walmart. But there is no greater good that can be done with this $400 million a year endowment than this opportunity that millennials have here. And so what she said to me is, Maya, in all that you do, ask yourself where you can do the most good. And sometimes that means starting your own organization, and it did for our founder, David Smith, and he's made a world of good happen. But really, that advice was sort of shocking to me to think about, could I do more good working in a foundation, giving out money, working with that endowment, or working for Mobilize? And I don't actually know the answer for myself yet, but I think that that's a really important point to keep in mind. So just in closing, I'm really, really proud to be a member of this generation. I feel that the potential that we have to solve some of our biggest problems is unlimited. And I think what's fantastic is that we continue to have such an optimistic and collaborative approach to things. The question I get asked most on my interviews, I did an interview for Fox Radio a couple days ago, and they said, well, Maya, aren't you angry about what other generations have done to your generation? And I think what's fantastic about the millennial generation is that we're not, because you can call them baby boomers and the greatest generation, but what we call them are our parents and our grandparents. And I think it's so important to work intergenerationally and have that context for the opportunities that we have today. And so I think that for the boomers and the greatest generation people in the room, I think the millennials will do you proud, and I know that the amazing people in this room will as well. So I just want to close and say that the best part of my job is traveling around the country and having the opportunity to speak to amazing young people such as yourselves. So please, if there's anything that we can do to help, or any questions that you have for me, please email, Facebook, Twitter, text, Nings, MySpace, etc. So thank you so much for having me talk, and I'd love to take some questions.
Where is Mobilize.com based out of?
We have offices in Berkeley, California, Washington, D.C., and we're opening one in Chicago. And then I'm going to Miami tomorrow to see what we can do about relocating me to Miami. There was a question over here.
For the girl that you talked about in the restroom who was bored, or who was afraid about being bored, there's a lot of high school students here. I wonder, what can we, as I guess I'm graduating senior this year, what can I do to, kind of kick my sister generation kind of in the ass, basically, pardon for the language, but say, get with the program, this is serious, there is a lot at stake for your generation and for mine, and we kind of share the same thing, being millennials. What can we do to inspire that kind of interest in public service, in community service, and in general interest in kind of what's going on?
That's a really, really good question, and I think what we've found as most effective is finding out what is most important to your sister, right? So many organizations talk about the presidential election and how you have to turn out and vote, but it's true that actually, especially for high school students that are voting for the first time as a high school senior, that the Board of Education elections, the City Council elections, who runs for mayor, those are the ones that have the most important impact on your everyday lives. So for me, Maplewood, New Jersey, where I grew up, we didn't have lights on our lacrosse field, and so we could only practice from 4 to 6:30. Even if we had a game, we had to call the game because we didn't have lights on our fields. And so organizing a group of young people to make a presentation to the Board of Education had a far greater impact than I could have had, voting in a presidential election at 18 years old. And so I think it's the responsibility of organizations to connect with their young people and to find out what are those most important issues to them, and then to talk about that. And there also needs to be some people call it arrogance and some people call it entitlement, and it could be whatever it wants, but we should have a great pride in all that our generation is accomplishing in all the different sectors. And if you aren't excited by that, and if you aren't engaged by that, then we just need to tell you more stories about all of the amazing things that millennials are doing. If you look at our armed forces, there are 1.8 million people who have served or are serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. 1.25 million of those young people are within our generation. This fall was the largest influx of returning millennial veterans who came back to our campuses through the aid of the GI Bill. We need to work on integrating every demographic of the millennial generation into the civic fabric of our communities so that as we become leaders in all of these different sectors, it'll just be institutionalized. We actually really stressed out my board of directors, but I said to them that I would like Mobilize.org to go out of business by the time the youngest millennial is the age of the oldest millennial, because there's too much redundancy in the nonprofit field that I really want to solve a problem. And I want to institutionalize this sense of millennial leadership so that I won't need to give this speech in 10 years because we'll just be leaders. And every person younger than you, your little sisters, your little brothers, my little brother who works at Prudential and thinks I'm engaged enough for the both of us, we'll just see his sense and his service to society. Sorry, that was a tangent.
In regards to the whole eco-friendly movement that's taking off, how do you think our generation, the millennials, will have an impact on it in 10, 20 years, and how that'll affect the global economy?
Well, I think the first thing, and really, we really view ourselves as part of a global community versus sort of Americans or some other label. So the things that are happening in sweatshops, the genocide in Darfur, climate change, all of those things that are happening to our globe, we're really taking a leadership role on. And I think what you're starting to see with businesses that our generation is starting is you're starting to see the triple bottom line. Is it going to make money? Are my customers happy? And am I doing a social good? So MTV just changed their sort of community affairs to now it's called pro-social. And so all of the business approaches that we're seeing, the social entrepreneurship, it's really having that eco-friendly, that climate-friendly, whatever-friendly movement. And so I think that, I hope at least, to see leaps and bounds. I saw someone here earlier wearing a Power Shift t-shirt. Is the gentleman here? No? Okay. So Power Shift is an amazing climate change, environmental movement. They brought 12,000 young people to DC last spring to advocate for legislation for clean energy and building a new energy economy. They made a huge splash in Washington, DC, and what they're doing this year is they're having regional conferences where thousands and thousands of young people are getting together to pressure their mayors and their governors to make a change. So I think from the grassroots to the grass tops, we're really doing a lot for that field.
Okay, so obviously the presidential election, is one of the huge elections and everything, but what are you guys doing to kind of alert the millennials that the off-year elections, with the senators and the congressmen and women of the House are also as important, because that could completely change, how our government's going to run, how the legislation is going to push through. So what do you guys do to usually, alert everybody about that?
So we run a program called SimVote, where we work with high school campuses and college campuses to do simulation elections around local races. So we create voter pamphlets about the issues being discussed and then actually simulate the election process, because two of the big reasons for why young people don't vote, even still, the first is that no one asked. And no one asked them to register. And number two is because it's sort of an overwhelming process for the first time if no one helps you. So we do a lot of simulation elections work. And then what we do is we find pieces of legislation that are really integral to what we feel passionate about. So for example, in 2007, there was a bill called the Deleting Online Predators Act that looked to ban social networks in college campuses, in high school campuses and libraries. So for many people, that was the only access they had to computers. And the idea was that what our generation was doing on Facebook and on MySpace was only looking at porn. And so we need not be doing that. And so Mobilize doesn't take a stance on that issue, but what we did do is we sent 5,000 messages to the sponsor of the bill telling them how, in fact, did we actually use social networks. We use them for homework, we use them to share pictures, we use them to communicate with friends, and how could they have put forth a bill that legislated the communication tools of our generation without consulting a single millennial? And that was an off-year election in 2006, and that was actually like a really big vote. So that's just one example of apparently a controversial bill. But yeah, that's a great question. There was a question, yeah.
I'll just talk about it. There's somebody right here. Oh, here we go. You commented that millennials are starting to turn their backs on the two-party system. But when it comes to political parties, there's a lot of resources stored in those parties. And if millennials are turning their backs on that, where do you think they'll be able to get those resources and those political opportunities if they're turning their backs on the traditional parties?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways that we're seeing the millennial shift in partisan politics. The first is through within the system, right? So you can be within a party and sort of change things, and either we saw the revolutionizing of technology within the DNC and the small dollar donations. But then also, it's my personal opinion that there needs to be more local organizing around different parties, because for you every 4 years to put out sort of a Green Party candidate and not build a base locally and work within, college campuses, local communities, I think there needs to be a little bit more local base building and around third parties, other parties, melding of parties, whatever. And I think that is where millennials can really take a leadership role.
Speaking of party politics, if you watch TV or you read the news, you can see that, unfortunately, party politics and partisanship are still very much thriving. As a matter of fact, it's almost trendy to politicize what seem to be universal human issues. But I think that really needs to change in our generation. And do you think that our generation has the ability to transcend those old boundaries and to focus on issues that really are universal and human? For example, equal advocacy.
So I do. I think that, so if you look at this past Senate election, we elected the largest number of young candidates, although this year the average age is the oldest it's ever been. So we're starting to change the makeup of our elected officials, and I think that's going to do a lot for it. And I think also the need for there to be local efforts that sort of model that. But whether we like it or not, in 10 years, 20 years, however long, we're going to be running. We're going to be in those positions. We're going to be elected officials. We're going to be nonprofit leaders. And so my dad is a conservative and my mom is a Democrat, and they sort of came to this country for divergent American dreams. And what my dad always says to me is, of course you're a liberal when you're young, Maya, but you'll get conservative when you're older. And it's not about keeping those labels, but it's about remembering the sense of collaboration and what we can accomplish together. And as long as we hold on to that as we begin to be decision makers in these different fields, I think we'll be all set. That's oversimplification, but.
And on that note, that was going to be the last question, and thank you so much.